End in Mind. So With the End in Mind was Kath's first book, and Listen is her next book. I hope that there'll be a slide showing so that you can take a photo. We are recording this session. We're recording Kath. We won't record you with questions at the end. And we're ready to go. So over to you, Kath.
I can't unmute. Thank you. I'm trying to unmute myself, and of course all participants are muted. Hi everybody. Ros, thanks for that lovely introduction. And thank you all for turning up on your precious lunch break. Some people who I don't know and some people who I do know, and it's lovely to see you all here. So I think we've got just under an hour, and I think we might be a mixture today of healthcare professionals who are usually the guests at these webinars, and interested members of the public who found out, I think through Twitter, that we were doing this today and booked to join us. That's fantastic, because for me, the thing that I really want us all to think about is how we uncouple the little bit of medical intervention that's important towards the very end of life from the really, really precious personal, existential family experience that's going on at the very end of life. So to have that breadth of company from all of you today is absolutely perfect. I've got a set of slides, but I promise it won't be kind of death by PowerPoint. It's mainly to remind me what to say next. So let's have a think about the way we use stories, to help each other to understand universal truths, to console each other, to provide wisdom. Now I'm just pressing a button, so I will only be able to see one little box of a person, and it's arrived on Ros. So if you can't see or anything's going wrong, Ros, it's your hand gestures that will tell me that it's all gone pear-shaped. So thinking about using stories. Now, if my slides would advance, that would be good, wouldn't it? Hurrah. So I was recently at a big international meeting. I saw some of you there, but it's important to have a conflict of interest slide when we're speaking in public. So you need to know that, well, Ross has mentioned I write books. And this isn't an advertisement for my books, but it's simply to let you know that because I'm talking about things that are in the books, if it leads you to buy a book, I have a financial interest in that of about 80p. I've recently also discovered with great excitement that if people borrow my books from libraries, I get around 11p a lend for that as well. So just so you know, I'm not trying to sell you a book. I'm not trying to send you to a library, but do go to your library because it's so important, and do use independent bookshops if you can. That I stand to make a little bit of money if you buy my books. How do we talk about dying? It's an interesting thing, isn't it, that it's become a thing that we've decided it's difficult to talk about. And I'm not really sure that it's as difficult as we believe. There are lots of bits of research that are reported in the academic literature, but that's not the same thing as this conversation about us as human beings and those really important, very basic ideas about living and dying in a satisfying way, in a comfortable way, in a way that has meaning for us. So I'm not really going to be talking about research. I'm going to be talking about observations and insights. I'm going to be talking about the human condition and the wisdom that I've gleaned from other people, dying people, their families, the other people who've been looking after them through 30 years in palliative care. There is a slide I wish I could have stolen from the meeting that Ros and I were both recently at in Rotterdam, though. And it was a slide from somebody talking about how much the public would like to talk more about dying, think that dying and death should be more widely spoken about. And in a massive audience of palliative care specialists, the speaker asked us to estimate what percentage of the population might want more discussion. And the bulk of the room, experts in dying and death, thought that it might be 20, 25, 30%. In fact, in all of the countries that they looked at around the world, the lowest was 70%. And that's been my experience. If you start to lift the lid on this conversation, people flock to you to join in. There's a thirst for good, reliable information that is based on multiple observations, based on a long experience, and not just one person's story of the thing that happened to them. So how do we share that wisdom? We're all sitting on experiences that will help people to understand. And my answer to that is the way we share wisdom is through telling stories. So let's think about the telling of stories. We've always done it. We've always talked about really hard stuff by putting it into fables and legends and stories that talk about universal things. So here we're talking about innocence and vulnerability, Little Red Riding Hood. We might be talking about murder. We might be talking about rape. We might be talking about abuse. We're talking about this dark stuff that can happen in the woods of our lifetime. We find it difficult to countenance the idea of death being permanent. And so our fables about death very often are sleep for 100 years. And here's a prince about to waken the sleeping beauty. We talk about difference. We talk about otherness. We talk about forbidden love. That's not a new conversation. That's not a 21st century conversation. That's been going on for hundreds and thousands of years. There have always been people who have been other, who have been different, and have yet been lovable and worthy of love. And just in case you can't spot him, here's the love interest in this picture. So The Frog Prince is a story about people with a meeting of minds. And what about death and immortality? So it may seem that we'd be more comfortable talking about dying if we didn't have to do it. And yet myth and legend that deals with immortality almost always deals with the wretchedness of living eternally compared with the short beauty of a transient life. So here's the Little Mermaid who has exchanged her fishtail for legs so that she can leave the water and woo her prince. But she's also exchanged her immortality for mortality, because otherwise she would be forever young and her companion would age and die. These are European legends, but there are legends around death and dying all over the world. So here's just one of them. This is from the Caddo Nation in North America, talking about how death came to the tribes. And originally, people were not permanently dead. People who died were put in a special grass house to wait for the next whirlwind. And the whirlwind, which was the spirit of God, would reanimate dead people. And one of the braves realized that if we continue to reanimate our dead people and yet we continue to have babies, eventually there will not be enough food for our nation. And so when the whirlwind next came, he closed the door of the grass house. And so death came to the First Nations in America. And he was outcast for that and now has to scavenge alone. Nobody will feed him. And his name was Coyote. So that's the legend of Coyote, one of the primitive myths of many of the American First Nations. But they're not just old stories. Here's a very recent story, the story of the boy who lived. And many of you will know the story of Harry Potter, which is all the huge collection of it is a fantastic metaphor for grief and loss. And if you have read it already and not seen the metaphor at play, I invite you to go back and read. But this little boy is alive because his mother's love was stronger than her death. And we look at love as one of the most important virtues in our whole society. And we struggle a little bit to say our D words, dying and death and dead, but we're completely hopeless about talking about love. So, once upon a time, using stories The thing that's difficult for us these days is that the best stories are written stories. They're stories where we can listen to somebody narrating, or we can read the narration for ourselves. We can pause, we can reflect, and the subtext can be made explicit. And that's much harder in video stories. So thinking about the way death and the important values in life are represented in the classic canon of novels is one of the ways in which we can learn. And lots of medical schools have medical humanities departments that encourage very broad reading by their students. But as we've lost sight of what happens during ordinary dying, I think perhaps great expectations are increasingly replaced, not just in the public, but amongst healthcare professionals, by really unrealistic expectations. So let's just have a little think about that. How did we stop knowing about, recognizing, being able to see the process in real time of ordinary dying? So this is the only bit of science in here today. This is just to prove I know how to use a graph. These are life expectancies at birth of babies born in England and Wales, is the very long graph, and then I've superimposed data from Germany towards the right-hand side of the slide as you're looking at it, just to show how across most of Europe we're all running in parallel. So I invite you first of all to look at that first third that's got a white background. Life expectancies of girl infants is the purple line and blue infants is the green line. And for hundreds of years, human beings generally didn't live to a great age, and average life expectancy at birth was somewhere in the late 30s to early 40s. As we move through the 20th century and into the 21st century, so that's the grey background, you can see that life expectancies are starting to rise. And during the first half of the 20th century, that's because there were fewer infant deaths as housing conditions and birth conditions and midwifery care began to improve. So the babies who survived then were able to live out a longer life expectancy. And so the whole population's average life expectancy started to increase. And then the white line there is 1948, which is the beginning of the National Health Service here in the UK. And then the second half of that curve, you can see that life expectancies are still rising. This is a decade by decade survey, and the data for the most recent decade, which ended in actually 2011, so 2021, so it's the 2020-2021 cohort. Those data are only just out and I haven't added them yet, but they're the first data that show that life expectancy of infants born here is no longer rising. And that's about what we're doing with our health, which is a completely different conversation, but important for us to think about. So there's a graph. Here's a story. The story is Annie, and Annie is born in Liverpool in 1900. So you can see that life expectancy for girl infants in 1900 is about 46, 47 years of age. And we're especially interested in Annie for two reasons. One is that she's a marker for a century because she's born at the turn of the century. But the other is she's my nana. She's my mum's mum. And so she's very important to me. So during her early life, during her teens and in her 20s, so that would be the 19 teens and the 1920s, she would have done the kind of work that women have been doing for centuries. When a person was so sick that they were dying, hospital had nothing to offer, they were looked after by family and friends at home, and my nana will have done that. And she would have been shown what to do and what was going on and had it explained to her calmly and matter-of-factly by the women of the generation above her, her mum, her aunts, so that she, in her turn, would have expected to pass that wisdom on to any children that she would have had, any daughters that she would have. And yet things are already changing. In the 1930s, so she's now in her 30s, she'd been married, she's been widowed, her oldest child has died of diphtheria, an illness we routinely immunise children against now. Her youngest child was newly conceived when her husband died of sepsis from a ruptured appendix. So In 1939, at the age of 39, she entered the Second World War with 4 school-aged children, no husband, living in poverty. And she followed her children out to the countryside. They moved out from Liverpool. All children were evacuated from our major industrial cities, and they went to live in rural Shropshire. 1948 is already a year past average life expectancy for Annie and for her cohort of girls born in 1900. So how did she do? Well, she did pretty well. I became a consultant in palliative medicine in 1995, and she was still with us. And a couple of years later, so when she was 97, she talked to me about being worried about her children when she died, worried about your mum, your auntie and uncles. And I thought she was talking to me about dying. And I thought, oh, I can talk to Nana about this. Silly me. You know, I'm not worried about dying. I know what happens when people are dying. I've seen it dozens of times. It doesn't bother me at all. It looks very gentle and peaceful. I hope it's comfortable. I know you've got really good drugs for discomfort these days. No, that's not what I'm bothered about. I'm bothered because I don't think your mum and her brothers and sister have ever seen a person die. And that kind of exploded my brain, that in the space of that generation, between my grandparents and my parents, the change had happened in life expectancies that was so big. And the change had happened in medical possibilities that were so transformational, that people didn't stay at home if they were so sick that they might die. Hospital now could do things. They could use antibiotics. They had anesthetics that allowed really complicated surgery. They could use dialysis machines and ventilators. There were intensive care units. There were better cancer treatments. There was organ transplantation. Transformation is enormous and it's so important and we need to celebrate it. And yet there's this unintended consequence of dying no longer being a person at home surrounded by the people who matter most to them, but dying being a patient in a bed surrounded by equipment and with people confined to visiting times, with a battle, and the battle metaphor grows stronger all the time, to save their life, and a failure if the battle is lost and the person dies. Wow. Transformational change. And so my Nana never got to explain to my auntie and my mum what ordinary dying was about. So people don't know. But the problem is with not knowing is that we don't know that we don't know. And so we replace what we don't know with information that we get from various places. So many of you will be soap fans, and, you know, no show of hands here. All the soaps in England use death as a plot. And in fact, all soaps around the world use death as a plot device. It's not about the dying person. It's about what happens to the other characters as a consequence of the fact that a character is dying. And that's why dying is done so badly. It's souped up, it's dramatized, it's made to stop you getting up and putting the kettle on. We very, very rarely see ordinary dying represented on television. And shout out for Coronation Street and their young mum dying of cervical cancer 3 or 4 years ago, which was a brilliantly done storyline. They were helped by the palliative care service at the Christie Hospital, and it was really, really well done. But in the main, what we see is souped up, unusual, horrible, terrible, dramatic dying. And people store that and think, oh, I wouldn't want that to happen to me. I wouldn't want that to happen to people who I love. At the same time as that, we've got newspapers that report all sorts of difficult scenarios, and we enjoy the entertainment of death, violence, scariness, being frightened out of our wits. So we love death as entertainment. We're just not great at talking about ordinary dying. And perhaps one of the myths, one of the stories that's most difficult for all of us to get our heads around is the story of cardiopulmonary resuscitation, CPR, what it can do and what it can't do. So because in soap operas, patients who are so sick that they have a cardiac arrest and there is then a resuscitation attempt, by the end of that episode, they're sitting up in bed having a cup of tea. Hurrah. Instead of unconscious, ventilated in an intensive care unit, if they're one of the lucky 2 in 10, or actually dead if they are the more usual 8 out of 10. So cardiopulmonary resuscitation, first aid for when there's a sudden and unexpected heart problem, and not a treatment for getting the heart restarted when it stops as we're expecting it to at the very, very end of it. And there is so much hoo-ha, isn't there, about how we protect ourselves from having intrusive cardiopulmonary resuscitation at a deathbed where the death is anticipated, but there isn't a piece of paper to say, it's okay, guys, you don't need to do that here. What we're doing is gentle, peaceful, anticipated dying. So here we are, a congregation of human beings who are interested in and have experience about being alongside people who are so sick that they are beginning to die, that they are in their dying, and that they have died. And rather than books, now we're using online facilities. So until last year, there was a fantastic podcast run by BBC 5 live out of their Salford studios, Yumi and the Big C, which was started by one of the 5 live journalists and 2 friends, 3 young women with cancer. And the series went on. The first of them, Rachel Bland, died in 2019, I think. One of the women had stage 1 breast cancer, and she talked about her treatment journey, her surgery, her chemotherapy. And the other journalist, Deborah, known to us all as a nation as Bowel Babe or Dame Deborah James, talking about check your poo, but all of them talking about cancer, huge cancer community, including talking about palliative and end of life care. Beautiful blog by Naomi Jane, talking about the last illness and then her experience of bereavement of her mum. Special to me because her mum was my friend Fiona, who was one of the consultants in palliative medicine in Leeds hospitals. Another fantastic blog by Claire Wise, a documentary producer. When she was no longer well enough to write her blog, when she was terminally ill at home, her brother took over the writing of the blog and used it as his space for reflecting on this major transition in his life as his sister, who refused to discuss the fact that she was dying, lay dying in the room next door. And then wonderful books, Linda Bellingham talking about her experience of cancer, Claire's blog being made into a book by her brother, Greg Wise. Some of you may have heard of him. Paul Kalanithi's wonderful book, When Breath Becomes Air, personal testimonies of a single person's journey. And I want to pay testament particularly today to Deb. It's a year and a day since she died. It seems impossible to me to think that somebody so vibrant has died. I nearly wore my Rebellious Hope t-shirt for us all today. That these are people whose storytelling captures people's hearts and minds and enables them to imagine what it would be like to be in that situation or to be alongside somebody in that situation. And yet for each of these, it's such an intimate view that what it can't do is stand back and give a kind of comparison overview. Those of us who've been in an experience of seeing dying and death up close and personal several times, or lots of times, or for those of us who work in palliative care or geriatrics or nursing care homes thousands of times, start to see the patterns that would have been the patterns that were explained to my Nana, that she was on standby to hand on. So let's think about how can we see the patterns? What about the stories that we could tell? So thinking about your experience, just do a little tot up now. How many deaths have you seen, been present alongside whilst a person was in the last weeks or days or hours of their life? You may not have been at the bedside as they took their last breath, but you've seen snapshots all the way through the process. And it's enabled you to see patterns in the process. patterns that give you a hunch that we should be sending for the family now, or patterns that give you a hunch that this family is a bit uptight and all sitting very close to the bed and there's a lot going on, and we could help them to relax a little bit and be a little bit more at home around this bed. Your stories that help you to work on the wisdom that's inside you, and in particular, your stories that help you to calm a person who's worrying about what a person who's deeply unconscious breathing pattern might look like, or that look like they're sleeping with their mouth open, because when we're deeply unconscious, our face muscles relax and the mouth will sag open, and that will actually tell us not that the person is struggling, but that the person is deeply, deeply relaxed. Are we sharing that information? Are we narrating the deathbed to the person who's never seen this before? Or are we leaving them to guess, and to perhaps guess wrongly and go away thinking that the open mouth meant really struggling to breathe, that the funny breathing effort meant the person was drowning or choking? We need to use our stories to help other people to understand. So let's think about telling our stories. Here's Atul Gawande, magnificent writer, an American surgeon, written many books, very fine books. His book, Being Mortal, is a wonderful personal reflection on what can a surgeon do when surgery is no longer a treatment option for his patients. And he consulted the palliative care attending physician at the hospital where he worked, Brigham and Women's in Boston, and drew great insights from watching her doing a ward round during which she made him sit down at every bed, which still makes me laugh when I read him talking about it, where she never produced a stethoscope. She, as he put it, just asked questions. And then she pointed out to him that she selects her questions as carefully as he selects the right scalpel for a particular job in an operating theatre. That these are not random questions. This is purposeful eliciting of people's stories. And how understanding what comfort you can help a person to have by acknowledging their mortality, by working with them to plan their care around their end of life. He then was able to do that very thing for his own father when he was dying. It's a really, really humbling read, and I absolutely recommend it to you. At the end of it, I was left hungry for more. I wanted to know what his practice was like afterwards. I wanted to hear his stories about his patients dying with better care around them. And he didn't tell them, but I had a few stories, and you've got a few stories. So here are mine, and I encourage you to tell yours. And increasingly, people are telling their stories and reflections of end of life. So here's our colleague, Rachel Clark, part palliative care doctor, part documentary journalist, who, again, absolutely wonderful storyteller. I really commend her writing to you. And around the world, stories are helping people to understand and make more sense of what's happening to patients. So I was talking to Christian Witzimira a couple of weeks ago at the European Association for Palliative Care. He's analysed the way African families behave in the presence of dying, and started to think about how the response of families arises from their own processing of their distress, and how could we be better at supporting families by recognising the behaviour patterns, each of which he's called after a different African animal. The word safari in Swahili, of course, meaning journey. So he's describing the journey of families alongside their dying person. Fabulous piece of work. So thinking about telling our stories, why does it matter? Well, if we can tell a story that enables another person to be interested in the person we're talking about and the village around that person, and the hook of the story, the thing that makes it of interest or of value or of importance now, and describe the journey that the person and their family took to get from the beginning to the end, what we're doing is distilling our experience and our wisdom into a story. And it's showing people rather than telling people. And that's how my Nana understood dying. She understood it by being there, by being beside people, by seeing it over and over again, until she'd seen it enough times to be able to recognize what was the big picture, the story, the recurring themes, the patterns that happen to human beings who are dying, and what was individual to this particular relative, friend, dying person, so that she was able to recognize the changes, that she was able in Liverpool, for example, to be able to send for family who might live over the water. So before the Mersey tunnels were built, over the water, family living on the other side of the River Mersey had a day's journey to get to visit people in Liverpool. And so letting people know was really important. Because in the end, what I've discovered from working in this space and talking in this space is that there is desperate curiosity from everybody to want to know and yet be afraid in case what they find out is going to worry them. Remember, like watching Doctor Who from behind the sofa, to want to know and yet not quite know whether you really want to know what is dying. And will I be able to bear it? And will the people I love be damaged by watching it happen to me? So here's my second story. I'm going to take you back now. This is a little bit of time travel to when I was a very new hospice doctor. And previously, I'd had a career plan to be an oncologist. So I'd chosen my medical jobs after I graduated to be working with wards and teams that were looking after really some of the very sickest people in the hospital. And that meant in the early 1980s that I saw a lot of deaths. And so I thought that by the time I changed tack to move into working in a hospice, which was later to be renamed Palliative Care, I thought I understood dying. And this was the patient who showed me that I'd learned practically nothing, and who showed me what it is that we've lost and the wisdom that we need to put back into the world. So Sabine was, I thought, an elderly woman. I realize now she was only a little bit older than I am now. But I was 26. I was young. I'd recently passed exams. I knew everything. You might remember that phase. Some of you might actually be young enough still to be in that phase, but it's okay. You'll get better. So as time went by in the hospice, I'm realizing that this is a lovely way of working. It's teamwork, it's patient focused, it's centered on family well-being. I really, really like this. And Sabine, a French woman with a shock of fantastically silvery white hair, was reaching the end of her life in our hospice from colorectal cancer with liver metastases. And she'd been living alone since her husband had died after a heart attack about 10 years before. This particular day, one of the nurses was helping Sabine to get her hair dried and back to its French perfection before she went back to bed after her shower. And so they were talking to each other through the mirror. Maybe it was that indirect eye contact that allowed this conversation to take place. But Sabine revealed to this nurse, confessed that she was afraid. She was afraid of dying, and she was afraid that she might die in overwhelming pain. This nurse could have said, "Oh, Sabine, don't need to worry about that. We're all here. We'll look after you. We'll manage your pain." But she didn't do that. She did something much more wise. She said, "Sabine, tell me about that worry." And so Sabine explained that if she should find herself at the edge of death in overwhelming pain, she might despair. She might despair in God. And if she were to despair in God, to her, a French Roman Catholic, that would be a mortal sin at her death. And that would mean that she could not go to heaven. And heaven was where she was completely sure her husband was waiting for her. So this wasn't really just fear of pain. It was a huge existential, spiritual, desperate fear for Sabine. And having finished making her look beautiful and put her back to bed, the nurse came down to the office to tell the consultant at the hospice about Sabine's worry. And I happened to be in the office at the time, and he said, "Oh, well, we need to go and talk to her about that. And Kathryn, you should come too." And because I'm 26 and I've recently passed a lot of exams and I know everything, I was a bit surprised because I thought I was quite good at pain control. But actually what was about to unfold was completely life-changing for me. So we went up the corridor and the nurse sat in the big chair beside the bed, and my consultant asked Sabine where he should sit. And because his parents were also French and he was fluently bilingual, he often had conversations with Sabine in the evenings, and we could see she was flirting with the handsome young doctor. So Sabine kind of patted the bed to show that he should sit there beside her. And then I sat on one of those tiny little footstools at the bottom of the bed, and I could see them as the conversation began. He knew her very well. He knew her very well enough that his opening gambit was, Sabine, I've heard that you're afraid that you might die in overwhelming pain. And I'm sitting on my footstool thinking, that's not very subtle, is it? But he knew her well enough that that was absolutely the right place to start. And she sat up and she locked her eyes onto his and she said, yes. And he asked her whether she'd ever seen a person die. And I thought, that's a really unusual question. And she said she'd seen two people die. She'd seen somebody die of gunshot wounds during the war. And she had watched her husband, she'd been with her husband when he was dying after his heart attack. He'd been in and out of unconsciousness. And the last time he was conscious, he was able to say all of the prayers with the visiting priest, which was what made her so sure that he was now in heaven. So my boss now said, well, I wonder whether it would help you, Sabine, if I described to you what we usually see as somebody's dying. And now I'm really surprised. Because of the jobs that I'd chosen over the previous 4 years of my career, I've seen a lot of people dying. And I absolutely know in my 26-year-old wisdom that no two deaths are the same. So how can he possibly say that? And so he began. The thing we noticed, Sabine, is that as time goes by, when people have an illness that's going to shorten their lives, it doesn't really matter what the illness is, whether it's a cancer or something wrong with their lungs or their heart or something else. Towards the very end of their lives, they just get more and more tired. They need more sleep. They're often not very interested in eating and drinking so much anymore. They may choose to spend more time in a chair or even in bed. But when they're awake, if the illness isn't affecting their mind or their brain, they have their usual sense of humor, they're pleased to see their visitors. And as time goes by, what we see is that people sleep more and are awake less. And you might even have noticed that's already starting to happen. And she sat a bit further forward and she got hold of his hand and she said, yes, I've noticed that. And he said, oh, well, that's good. And I'm thinking, how can he say that's good? Because she's just said that she started the process of dying. And he said, oh, that's good. But what he said was, oh, that's good, because that already shows us that you are following the ordinary pattern. Shall I tell you what happens next? If this gets too much at any point, you just tell me to stop and I'll stop. And she said, yes, go on. And so he explained that as time goes by, what we notice is that people need more and more sleep just to recapture enough energy to be awake for a very short space of time. And eventually people may not wake up at all. Sometimes they look as though they're asleep and we try to waken them for an important visitor or a phone call or medicine time, and we can't waken them. Later on, they might wake up, tell us they've had a lovely sleep, so we know that they were deeply unconscious, but they have no knowledge of that. Human beings don't recognize when we're unconscious. It's not distressing for us. But at that point in the illness, we would know the person might not wake up for their important medicines. And I can see, for example, that you're taking paracetamols regularly for your pain. And at a time when you don't wake up at medicine times anymore, we'll think of a different way to make sure that your painkillers are still in your system. Then, because they were both French, they had a completely unnecessary conversation about suppositories, but I'll spare you that. They went on to the next step. And I kept thinking, he surely is going to stop in a minute. When people are deeply unconscious, he said to her, the only bit of their brain that's really working is the bit that drives their breathing. And so now their breathing comes in automatic cycles, just a reflex pattern. And that pattern is very familiar to us. It moves backwards and forwards between very deep breathing, gradually becoming more and more shallow, and then going back to deep breathing again, and between very fast breathing that gradually gets slower and slower, even with pauses and longer pauses, and then back to the beginning again. So if your nieces and nephews are visiting and your breathing is perhaps shallow but fast, you could understand they've never seen this before. They might think that you were working hard to breathe. And we'll explain that it's not that you're breathless, not uncomfortable. Obviously, we'll check. But this is breathing that we see in people who are unconscious and safe during their dying. At other phases, breathing might be slow and very deep, and the breath might come out through the voice box with a kind of sighing noise. And again, families can be startled by that and worry that the person's trying to speak or is feeling uncomfortable. And of course, we'll check. But almost always we can tell them, no, this is the ordinary breathing of a person who's quite safely and comfortably dying. Sometimes there's a tiny little bit of fluid in the back of people's throats. It's only about a teaspoonful. It might be the fluid that we use for keeping their mouth moist and comfortable. It might be a little bit of phlegm that's come up from their chest or dribbled down from the back of their nose. It's not enough to get in the way of the breathing. We can hear the air moving in and out of the lungs, but it bubbles through the fluid. It makes a strange clicking noise. We call it the death rattle, and it tells us that the person is now so deeply unconscious they can't even feel that tender area, that sensitive area at the back of their throat. It doesn't make them cough or gag or retch. It just lies there, not in the way, but making a noise that sometimes can startle families a little bit. And so we need to explain what's causing it. She's sitting further and further up. She's now grabbed both of his hands and she's stroking them with hers. I'm thinking he must be going to stop in a minute, but no, he's still going. And at the very end of somebody's life, he says, what we see happening is that usually during one of the phases of slow breathing, there will be a breath out that just isn't followed by another breath in. There's no sudden rush of pain at the end, no feeling of panic or fading away. It's just very, very gentle. And she nodded. And she picked up his hands and she shook them like dice. And then she brought them to her lips and she kissed his hand. She lay herself back against her pillows and closed her eyes, and her shoulders dropped in relaxation, and she kind of signaled that, okay, you guys can go. Wow. I had just had the most important piece of education in my life, I think. I had to run away to make tea and hide in the kitchen while I dried my tears. Two huge concepts, both at the same time. One, how have I never noticed that process of dying that he has just described? And as he was describing it, I realized I've seen it countless times. But I was always the most junior doctor trying to stop dying from happening, right? Because that had always been the job. So I'd be so worried about that person's oxygen levels and that person's kidneys and that person's heart that I hadn't stood back and seen that there's this same pattern happening from person to person to person that my nana would really have recognized. And also, not only can we describe the process of ordinary dying, that in the end is so much more gentle than most people are expecting, we can describe it to a dying person, and instead of horrifying them, it comforts them and it consoles them, because knowing is better than wondering. Knowing what to expect helps us to be prepared. And what we have to describe to them is not terrifying. It's surprisingly gentle. And I guess that episode was the thing that forged my career in palliative care. And it's the story that made me write with the end in mind afterwards. Because what we are about, who are gathered here today, is about changing the public's understanding of dying. And every time somebody's dying, That's an opportunity for us to learn more, to observe, to see the patterns in action, to see what's the usual pattern and what's different about this person and the people who love them. And every time we are involved, it offers us an opportunity to help the people around the dying person and the dying person himself, if they want to understand and be better prepared and less afraid. Having witnessed that conversation between Sabine and my boss, probably 40 years ago now, I've had that similar conversation hundreds, maybe thousands of times. I always, like he did, say to people, if this gets too much, you just tell me to stop. Nobody's ever stopped me. What happens is that kind of fascinated interest, because it never gets to the place that's so awful that it sounds unbearable. And usually what happens at the end of the conversation is there's kind of pause, and then the person says, oh my word, will you tell my husband that, my wife that, my kids that, my parents that? That's not what any of us is expecting. Please give them the comfort of knowing this too. Because although every person's individual and so every death is individual, these patterns are recognizable, they're describable, we can help people to prepare for them. And we can only do that if we're prepared to talk about dying, if we're prepared to be in a room and say to a family, what do you think about your dad's breathing? Has your mum looked as comfortable as this all night? That's a strange noise that that person's making just now. What do you think about that? And if they say, oh, well, we know that's the death rattle, that just means that she's deeply unconscious and she's not uncomfortable. Hey, that's fantastic. Somebody else has already told them the story. But if they say, oh, we've been listening to that noise all night, it's terrible. My mum's clearly drowning, isn't she? She's choking. It must be awful. It must feel terrible for her. Then we have an opportunity to help them to understand what's actually happening instead of taking that awful misinterpretation into their bereavement. We have to share our wisdom, and we have to change public understanding by meeting people where they're at and helping them to know more. And each family that knows more is a family of people, a village that can go out and carry on changing that understanding. So it is time. There's nobody else stepping up to do that. It's up to us, people who are interested, professionals and non-professionals alike, because dying isn't a medical process. Dying is a deeply personal process. It's about who we are. It's about who matters most to us. It's about farewelling and being ready with a tiny slice of medical input that stops symptoms from getting in the way. So this is not just a medical conversation. I would go so far as to say it's not even a medical conversation. This is a conversation for the wise people. And that's any one of us and could be all of us. And it's time for us to start those conversations and help people to be better prepared and so much less afraid. Ros told me that I had to tell you how to buy my books. So this feels a little bit embarrassing, but there are some QR codes there which will take you to the publisher's website. And this is my little reminder to you that there are choices on that website that are not international robbers. There are people who will sell you books in independent bookshops or order them for you. Please, let's help independent bookshops. Thank you all very much for being here, and I'm going to turn my slides off now because they'll now be